We will now move to our second panel discussion, which we call Commercial Perspectives of FDIs into the Philippines and Philippine Startup Ecosystem. Our panelists for this segment are Katrina Rausa Chan, Executive Director, QBO Innovation Hub, James Lette, Chair, ASEAN Business Angel Alliance, and this session will be moderated by Victor Tay, CEO, China-ASEAN Business Alliance. Over to you, Victor, and panelists.
Thanks everyone being here. And yes, for this session, our topic talks about the commercial perspectives of FDIs into Philippines and Philippine startup. Early on, we had a keynote speaker who spoke about what had happened at the FDI scenes, especially at the investment law that's been transformed. And then we had a second panel, a keynote who actually talked about the startup ecosystem that has been transformed as well. So I guess when it comes to our agenda for panel 2, we'll be talking about the commercial perspectives and as well as the startup ecosystems, which the MC has introduced. Within the speaker itself, we had Katrina Chan, who is Executive Director of QBO Innovation Hub, will be actually highlighting more about the startup ecosystems and also in terms of how the startups have been when it comes to attracting foreign direct investments. And then we have James Lette, who heads the Angel Investors Network in ASEAN. I think he'll be giving an excellent perspective on among the ASEAN countries and how they have found Philippines as an attractive place to be. And later on, he'll also be giving his experience of some of those companies that he had invested, and also in terms of perhaps some of the challenges or risks that he had been looking at. And now the first part is in Philippines itself, I think we've seen multiple credit rating company who actually has given Philippines an improved credit rating, and we've seen an array of them from S&P, Fitch, JCRE. This aspect actually have been looking at improving from in the past and then to now A-, BBB+, and BBB. So this very much had highlighted Philippines as a credible and also in terms of a strong market to go into. And early on, the keynote speaker highlighted about the new investment law. We saw, given the transformation itself, and then we have seen now 100% foreign ownership is permissible. And at the same time, they have derived an expert visa, which actually allows foreign experts to gain easy access to Philippines. And also in the process as well, they have strengthened the whole startup hub and position Philippines to actually attract more startup ecosystems in there. So Philippines has actually progressed from 6th to 4th ranking. And that was what the first keynote speaker spoke about. I think this very much when you stack across the 10 different ASEAN countries, I think we've seen the value of FDI has improved quite a bit. And here it is from 5.2 billion to 9.2 billion, almost doubling in terms of the FDI. The few top investing countries who invested in Philippines were Singapore, Japan, USA, Hong Kong, and Germany. So Philippines not only as a strong or credible market to be invested into, it also presents one of the larger market in ASEAN. Being the second largest, it actually had a 108 million population with an average age of 25 years old. And this actually shows an increased procurement power amongst this growing PMAT population. And amongst this consumers and also the citizens, we see that Philippines has one of the second largest digital consumers here. And this, in comparison, that we saw Vietnam as number 1 with 41%, and Singapore and Philippines join at 2, second place for digital consumption. In terms of social media user, the Philippines tops all the social media users in ASEAN with about 3 hours and 53 minutes on a daily basis. This very much shows a very technology, internet savvy population here. And therefore, I think in terms of e-commerce and food delivery have been a sector for growth in terms of Philippines as a country highlight. And within the e-commerce market or industry, where we stack up across the various countries, I think Philippines is well poised as one of the top e-commerce retail growth country. And with this, I think in terms of the startup ecosystem itself, we saw a strong growing incubation environment with about 700 startups, 35 incubators, accelerators, 50 plus investors, and also about 40 plus venture capitalists, altogether valued at about $2 billion for investments here. So I think where the panel discussion we had both panelists. I think one would be looking at a startup perspective and also giving us a deep dive on the ecosystems, and the other one will be highlighting about, I think, from an investor perspective and from the industry, the focus for investment as well as the ASEAN community perspectives of it. So I think with this, perhaps I think we'll just give a round of introduction to, I think maybe Katrina and James, if you can actually highlight on your area of job scope, as well as in terms of your what do you do and how and what do you see of this commercial perspectives given this new change of investment law? Yeah, perhaps Katrina will start first.
Yeah, hi Victor. Thanks for the introduction. So I'm Kat Chan. I'm the executive director of the Idea Space Foundation. We actually kind of have two sort of arms that might be relevant to discuss today. The first is to we are an early stage investor here in the Philippines. So we've been running an accelerator program as well as an early stage investment fund primarily focused on Philippine startups for the last 10 years. And we also work very closely with the Department of Trade and Industry. So Yusek Fita from the previous speaker, as well as the DOST, the Department of Science and Technology, on a program called QBO Innovation Hub. So we run maybe like 100 or so events and sessions a year. That's all about that's all oriented towards uplifting the Filipino startup ecosystem. We work with hundreds of startups. I think over 700 startups now in our community, as we like to call it. And yeah, like it really runs the gamut from, like inspiring new kind of entrepreneurs to get started with their businesses to supporting startups that are scaling up their operations to different countries. So I believe that's actually how we met, Victor. We brought like a delegation of startups over to Singapore not too long ago. And yeah, like for investors and startups that are looking to enter the Philippine market, like we're, very happy to help out in that regard as well. So yeah, I'm happy to have this discussion and chat about all things Filipino startup.
Yes, thanks, Katrina. And yeah, and thanks for leading the delegation to Singapore. Much later, we also explore how having startups on both sides in Philippines as well as in Singapore, how the tie-up could also somehow benefits on mutual FDIs and in terms of both ecosystems collaboration. So perhaps we ask James. James heads the ASEAN Investment Alliance, right? And perhaps you can give us a bit of a focus on what you were doing, and also later on give us a sentiments in terms of what you see of the investment law changes that was highlighted by our first keynote speaker.
Yeah, thanks, Victor, and hello to everyone that's listening, and g'day again, Kat. My name again is James Lette. I obviously have private business interests, but why I'm here today, I'm involved in angel investment, particularly in the Philippines. So I am one of the people that helped set up an angel investment group in the Philippines called the Manila Angel Investors Network, and I took that group from small beginnings to over 100 high net worth individual members in the Philippines. I've syndicated around 25 seed and early stage investments into startups in the Philippines. Through that, I've gotten involved at the ASEAN-wide level with other angel groups, and we've formalized a relationship into the ASEAN Business Angels Network, which has been established in Singapore, where I am a resident as well now. which basically it seeks to promote cross-border angel investments, so sharing deals amongst angel groups. So if you are living in Singapore, you can work with Maine through this group to access high-quality pre-vetted deals that have due diligence and have been looked over by locals that know the market and the industries and the risks. And it's a great way to do these cross-border investments as a small angel investor. In terms of your question, Victor, around the sentiment, I've been bullish on the Philippines for a number of years now, and it just keeps getting better and better from my point of view. I mean, the last few years in particular, in terms of the startup ecosystem, have been fantastic. I'm very pleased to have invested in a number of deals in the Philippines. Some of them are doing incredibly well. The government is really getting behind the startups, as you saw USEC speaking earlier about the huge range of initiatives that the government's having. And I think it's seeing fruit, but it's not simply the government. The government basically needs to knock down the roadblocks and the bumps in the road and let the founders get on with it, which is what we as investors do as well. And it comes back to, and I'm sure Kat can talk about this, it is the quality of the founders is what you're backing. And the Philippine founders are some of the best in the ASEAN, in my view, having seen founders from across the ASEAN.
Yes, thanks for the sharing in terms of your bullish perspective on the Philippines market. I'm sure among the audience here, a lot of them will be asking, what are the sectors they are focusing on? And of course, just now at the backdrop, we had highlighted that the digital sector seems to be one of the most attractive, where I think we see the internet savviness, technology savviness of Philippines, and also in terms of market, one of the second largest market within ASEAN. Yeah. So James, any industry perspective or sector that you've
getting some feedback, so I hope that's not on my end. But basically, the Philippines is an untapped market in many ways. You can pretty much name an industry and a sector, and a lot of it is broadly undisrupted. So there's huge opportunities to find a credible founder with a credible business idea that can succeed. Obviously, the Philippines market's well known for its e-commerce. You saw that in the fantastic growth rates in your presentation earlier, Victor. FinTech has always been a huge market. 1 in 10 Filipinos lives overseas. I think there's about $3 billion a month US remits back into the country. So a lot of that drives a very easy pickings for a number of businesses. But you name it, it's one of the most urbanized and quickly urbanizing countries in the ASEAN. It's got, fantastic market fundamentals. It's got some, I don't know the latest, but there was real growth rate was the second fastest in the ASEAN in 2021, I understand. Pre the current aspects, it had some very good unemployment rates, similar to Indonesia. Inflation until recently was low. So it's ticking all these boxes. As you mentioned, it's got a 110 million people. It's this fantastic sandbox that you can test applications that can then succeed in other markets, particularly into the United States, some of what we've invested into, because it is an English-speaking market. You can test it there and grow into the American market and then get those American valuations. So I'll leave it there. I could talk your ear off on it, but I'll let you get into it.
Yes, so thanks for highlighting. Yeah, fintech, technology sector, and I'm sure Katrina, in terms of QBO focus, specifically from the incubator's point of view, are there specific sectors that you feel are vibrant, and therefore, when it comes to the audience here who are looking into Philippines, that you may wish to highlight?
I think James covered a lot of it, but essentially, I think you could kind of classify it as sort of the things that are already kind of going very strong and are ready to kind of go right now, right? And fintech is definitely one of the areas where Philippines is very strong. I'll also highlight, right, the iron triangle of the e-commerce, fintech with logistics, right? So definitely the growth in terms of that space is very, very tangible. As someone that lives and is based in the Philippines, I can tell you that, the consumption from the consumer end, right? Like the adoption of digital products and services, especially when it comes to e-commerce, is very, very strong here in the Philippines. And then I think one thing that maybe James didn't mention was on the more established end is around the sort of creative economy and the creator economy, right? So I think Kumu is one of our kind of shiny examples here. But then again, you look at kind of podcasts, you look at, I don't know, like content creators, even the talent around, like I think even in Singapore, there's like a stereotype about like all Filipinos can sing and things like that. I don't know, or good karaoke. But anyway, there's a lot of potential in those markets, and things we're already seeing kind of bearing fruit, even in kind of specific consumer verticals. I think outside of that, like we are looking at a few spaces that are a bit more emerging, right? That still require a bit of investment, but also show a lot of promise. I would say these are in ed tech, in medical and telemedicine as well. Lots of things where there's, again, emerging market, kind of large consumer economies. And I think a lot of these solutions are very scalable, not just from the Philippines perspective, but in many developing or emerging markets. And I think a third one I'd want to also point out would be kind of like a depth of expertise when it comes to like kind of enterprise SaaS and software solutions. The Philippines has a long kind of history of being a global outsourcing kind of destination, and we do have a lot of kind of knowledge and industry expertise when it comes to that, and sort of translating some of the issues there into solutions that can be deployable globally from day one is something that we're seeing a lot of as well. Maybe not as sexy as some of the consumer brands, like B2C brands, right? Like that have been prominent in ASEAN, but also something where I feel the Philippines has a kind of unique advantage. So yeah, that's kind of, but yeah, largely agree with James' comments. I'm also bullish across the different sectors. There's a lot of untapped potential for sure. And very, very good founders to, put it simply.
Yeah, so consumer, definitely a very large market, second largest in ASEAN, and therefore edtech, e-commerce, fintech, and Katrina also highlighted in terms of the B2B space where the BPO, business process, software, also areas that for those audience here who are interested to look at. So these are sectors that you can actually focus on. So perhaps we can actually focus on James' experience, or maybe the alliance that actually represent a community of investors. How have the experience been in the past decade when it comes to investing in the Philippines, right? Maybe you can just give some case studies or draw some examples so that our audience could actually understand.
I can only talk to 5 years ago, I think it is probably. So it's changed markedly. I mean, Katrina has been more at the coalface than I have, but as an investor, the quality and the range of opportunities has been increasing. So as Katrina and I've mentioned, the founders keep getting better and better. But that said, I've had some fantastic wins. I was one of the with Maine, we were a seed investor in Kumu, and they're now on Series C, the first Series C in the Philippines. We've seen the focus grow. So obviously fintech's always been very strong in e-commerce, but we've seen now we've got investments in health tech, we've got investments in ed tech, and also in fitness and accounting and HR and ghost kitchens. There's a large range of areas that you can invest in, and there's these fantastic founders that are looking for backing. But it's a much more interesting space. So there are more people coming in from Singapore and from overseas and looking at where can they find the next Kumu? Where can they find the next unicorn? Because they will be, and they are now coming out of the Philippines. Philippines has always been a very strong ecosystem, and comparatively, it's been just as good as other countries in the ASEAN, but it's been overlooked by investors. But now the investors are turning their attention to that. So we're seeing American VCs, family offices from Singapore, a whole range of investors coming into the Philippines and coming earlier and earlier into the investment space. So there's some great things are happening now. And I think if you to be an investor today in 2022, I think in the next couple of years, you'd see some fantastic outcomes if you invest wisely and understand the space. I mean, there are world leading things happening in the Philippines in the crypto space, which I'm by far not an expert in, but Philippines has started to lead the world in this play to earn space that's developing, and in some DAO cryptos. No idea what that is, not an expert, but there's very quiet, and unless you're in that space, you don't know, but there's some fantastic opportunities if you look for them.
Yes, so I guess Philippines presents quite a different market, and there are different characteristics compared to the rest of ASEAN, which you want to highlight some of those unique characteristics so that for the audience here, so they might want to, when they invest in it, watch out for the characteristics. Some could be positive and some could be a risk area, right?
Yes, there's a number of most of the countries in the ASEAN have these interesting demographies. They have some changes that are going on that are very attractive for investment. But what the Philippines has, and as an investor, at the end of the day, if you're looking at investing cross-border, you could choose to put your money anywhere. You could choose to put it into the United States. You could choose to put it into Malaysia. So why would you pick Philippines rather, over all these other countries? And the key thing for me, I think, unless you have that connection to the Philippines, it is about value. I think historically the marketplace in the private sector, the startup ecosystem, it's been overlooked. So the values have been lower than in other countries. And if you were to say, I was mentioning to you the other day, if you were to say to me, if I wanted to invest in Vietnam 5 years ago to get the outcome that they're seeing now, I would look at the Philippines. If you invest in the Philippines today, I think we're on the cusp of some very rapid growth that you will see in returns as an early stage investor. So that's the number one thing. The second thing is, as with any cross-border investment, which is why at the ASEAN level, we're collaborating between groups from each country in the ASEAN, between angel networks, is how do you do that in a way that minimizes the risk to you as an investor? I mean, early stage investing is very risky. It's a high risk asset class. Doing it cross border adds another layer to that. So the best way to do that is by collaborating and partnering with people in country who know the culture, who know how the system works, because every country in the ASEAN is different. So if you were to get involved with a Singapore angel group, you can collaborate with Maine in the Philippines. You can understand through Maine that they know the markets, they know the players, they know the culture, they know how the systems work. And as similar to if you're doing it in Singapore, I wouldn't invest from the Philippines into Singapore without some of that local knowledge. So it's get involved. Contact groups like Maine, talk to Kat and her staff, and rely on those people that are already there and doing the due diligence and looking at these opportunities, and take their lead, and you'll be more successful as an investor.
All right. So from James' point of view, it seems like Philippines are most of the startup or companies who are on a lower valuation, makes it quite attractive for acquisition investments. And the second point that James highlighted were when you get into a foreign market, book with someone who is who understands local expertise, who had the local network, and that brings us to Katrina, right? Which QBO acts in this role, and in this aspect, you actually incubate not just Philippines startups. I suppose you're quite open to also international startups as well. Maybe Katrina may want to give us insights about QBO does in terms of begetting local networks and some of the local expertise as well.
Sure. Yeah. Like I do think there are a few pieces to this, right? So it's um developing the startups locally that are, good to invest in, right? And I think there's and there, like there again, the quality of founders, especially in the last couple of years, has definitely increased. Like there's a lot more experienced founders also kind of coming in terms of like this isn't their first idea anymore, right? Like maybe a smaller exit, or just more experience from some of the regional kind of startups that are coming into play when it comes to the kind of the founders and the startups that are being built today that make them easier to invest in. We heard a bit about from the government also about the programs that they've instituted to support the local founders and kind of make that process easier, right? On the investor end, James talked a lot about this, right, in terms of the valuations and how there's still a lot of profit or good money to be made, good return to be made, right, from investing in the local ecosystem. And then I guess to your direct question about how we support founders here, like from wherever they might be from. So our fund doesn't actually typically invest. I mean, it's a more Philippine focused fund, but but we also do look at a lot of companies that have a significant presence in the Philippines, right? And I think that brings me to the Philippines as a market. It's quite substantial, right? It's the second largest in the region, as has been pointed out several times in this talk. And it's also English speaking, right, which works both from a talent perspective when it comes to kind of recruiting or kind of building talent, but also kind of understanding markets and kind of building products that are kind of scalable easily, right? So I think there are a number of companies perhaps that would want to consider kind of entering the Philippines as a next market, like, or maybe a large market for their operations. And that is an area where we are able to provide assistance, whether it's through soft landing programs or kind of helping people set up and find their networks, partnerships, and things like that to be able to operate effectively and understand the local market, which is quite substantial as well. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question, Victor, but I think there again, there's several aspects to this, like whether it's investing in a company that was kind of originated locally, or whether you are a startup that's looking at market expansion. And obviously, like, to be able to have like to justify unicorn valuation here in ASEAN, like you can't be a single market player, right? So I think like the Philippines is definitely like one of the big markets to tackle. And then as an investor, again, there are many reasons, both from a valuation perspective and also kind of ease of doing business and other kind of regulatory factors that kind of make it, I think, a solid choice to invest in companies that are either based in or at least operating in the Philippine market.
Yeah, at this juncture, I wonder from the floor, any audience, if you have any questions, you may wish to type into the Q&A part. And where this, I think you could actually ask, we have James, who is from the ASEAN Investment Alliance. They are conversant in terms of investing in the 10 countries as well as the Philippines. And of course, Katrina from QBO that actually looks at helping startups and in terms of augmenting investment as well as helping them to go overseas market. So feel free to type in the Q&A if you do have any questions. But if you have been following our conversation, we had actually spoken about why Philippines has been a significant market to go into, second largest, consumers, which is English speaking, social, internet savvy, and in terms of social media hours that they spend on. And of course, I think where James, being an investors in this region, highlighted that bullish about the Philippines market since relatively attractive valuation, and therefore that allows them to go in there for the past few years. Yeah, so at this juncture, maybe we can ask both James and Katrina, right? While we're waiting for questions from the floor, perhaps give us a case studies over companies that you have worked with, or companies that you had actually collaborated with, and so therefore to encourage our audience here, right? So that they if they have interest to actually address the market, they could actually lend some experience from a showcase that you can actually illustrate to them. Yeah, so Katrina and James, either one of you.
Yeah, it might be good if Katrina, you could talk about the ones that you just brought to Singapore. There were, I think there was a roadshow of about 5 startups came into Singapore, and they all have interesting stories. They're all, currently looking for investment, but they're all very different spaces. Might be useful to touch on those, Katrina.
Right. Yeah, I think again, they're very varied, right? So I suppose on the consumer end, I think again, one of the more kind of famous examples probably are again the content and media space. So we have Kumu or Podcast Network Asia, right? That are basically have raised kind of subsequent rounds, but are still again growing, right, in terms of developing kind of content and media kind of assets. The ones that we brought to Singapore, I'll mention a school system, so they're an ed tech play, right? So basically they're what I think our average age here in the Philippines is 25, so it's they're, I don't know, 20-30 million kind of learners or students still kind of in the pipeline. And but again, these same sort of systems are quite scalable elsewhere. I mentioned kind of enterprise oriented solutions earlier. I know we brought, for example, Singapore Racia, right? It's one of the largest platforms for endurance sports. But then we also have things like Fitscovery, for example, where they're addressing more B2B markets around, giving health and wellness programs, right? Both online and enabling kind of, more independent or indie gyms or I don't know, Peloton instructors or whatever, right? To have an online presence. Yeah, on the e-commerce end, we have things like Great Deals. I mean, I can probably spend half a day kind of talking about some interesting startups, right? I think in the ones we brought to Singapore, we even had some of the commodities market, again, HR, AI solutions,
yeah,
right? So
it gives you that it confirms that there is this very wider range of opportunities. There are founders that are very talented and credible, who are doing a huge range of things. I mean, Maine itself, at the moment, we just pitched a fintech that's doing on remittances called Tang App, Pouch, which is another, but using the Lightning Network to transmit money. We looked at a property improvement company that's using AI to help with selling property. We also looked at a neobank sort of one. So there's a huge range of opportunities currently in the market. I mean, one that Kat mentioned is Fitscovery. We invested in that. I personally invested in that. We're very interested in how they're going to go, not just in the Philippines, but they're also looking in other markets. I think they're in Korea recently. So there's these, if you have an interest as an investor, there's a particular sector, you can find someone in the Philippines trying to do that. And
just to echo that sentiment, I think it's a very vibrant market. And I think with for any, whether an angel investor or you're looking at something more strategic, right? It's really also about finding a space that you feel comfortable and knowledgeable investing in, right? But there are plenty of startups. I think again, you name an industry or a subsector, some sort, right? There are quite a number of companies that you can potentially look at, and we're also seeing a lot more kind of uptake and success stories, not just from within the local market, in terms of subsequent kind of investment rounds or bigger partners with the local conglomerates and offices, right? But also in the international markets, we're seeing significant kind of interest and uptake in a lot of these companies. So I think it's difficult to go wrong, right? Again, provided that, as James mentioned earlier, you work with some of the local players with boots on the ground to kind of do your diligence, right? And understand
Yeah,
like which
yeah.
companies are strong. But
And there's a lot more going on. I mean, in the last year, in 2021, rather, I was reading there's around $1 billion got invested into the ecosystem, which is more than the previous 4 years. So that's what I said, that it's basically, yeah, if there are other markets where you said, gosh, I wish I invested 4 years ago, I can't afford to invest now. This is where the Philippines is at this moment. The money, 4 years worth of money previously has come in 2021 alone. 2022 is going to be even better. So that's driving the interest, and it will drive if you invest wisely and collaborate with some of the people on the ground, you'll see the fruits of that action that you take today to look at the Philippines will come through in the coming years.
Yep. So that basically resonate with what our speakers from BOI highlighted that from 2017 to currently, I think they had a 9.2 billion in terms of FDIs, and that basically had almost doubled what it was in the earlier 5 years, from 2011 to 2015, or 2001 to 2016. Yeah. So and on top of that, BOI and DTI had highlighted for our audience who are here and are interested to, if you actually would invest in the Philippines, there's a new incentive system. And within here, the strategic investment priorities plan that offer incentives to startups. And that allows startups with readily commercializable products to actually engage in some of these incentives. And at the same time, some of this startup enablers that could also enjoy income tax holiday, duty-free importation of capital equipment, as well as additional incentives over from deduction as power expenses, labor, training, and also in terms of locally made raw materials expenditures, right? So for those who are still who are interested in it, and I think you could also talk to DTI as well as BOI in the process. Now, I guess we're into the last minutes, and I guess looking at the Q&A, I don't quite see anyone putting any questions yet. And with this, perhaps I'll just give one last round to James and Katrina, right? What's the final advice that you would give to those who are interested to come in? I guess for James, there are definitely bullish about it. There are also risk areas as well. Any advice to the investors around?
What you just mentioned, Victor, earlier is, and panel 3, I think the next panel today will draw out more, is that one of the beauties in a way is that you can invest into the Philippines, at least in the startup ecosystem within Singapore, because a lot of Filipino companies have incorporated here because when they need to do the later stages, when the VCs become involved, the VCs like certain aspects of the Singapore market. So a lot of the Philippine founders have incorporated here. So, but you'll talk about that in a lot more detail in the next panel. But I mean, as I said earlier, and the advice for anyone is, you all know, and I can only talk about early stage investing. There are other forms of investment in FDI that you can do into the Philippines, but private market angel investing and startup investment it's a high risk asset class. So you need to do it in ways that minimize those risks that you can control, and one of those is working with local partners like the Middle Angel Investors Network, QBO, other providers, to make sure that you do your due diligence properly, understand what you're investing in and those local nuances, the local cultural effects on that market, the way that the markets operate. You're disrupting certain supply chains, and the way those supply chains work differently in every country due to local factors. So do it in a way that takes away those risks that you can. You obviously, the key thing for investing is you're investing in those great local founders, the Filipino founders. But rely for your due diligence on those resources that are there doing it anyway. But Kat, I'm sure you've got some other excellent
Actually,
advice.
like I largely agree with James, actually, or I fully agree with James. I think first point really is that there is, there's a lot of people don't know about the opportunities in the Philippines, and I do want to reinforce again what we've both been talking about here, that there are plenty of opportunities to invest and to make a good return, and even beyond that, to really kind of support you know founders that are building solutions, to very scalable solutions to problems that are, like, have regional if not global applications, right? And there's a lot of that being done in the Philippines right now that maybe isn't very well known to a number of investors. So hopefully, forums like this kind of help with that. So that's the first point. I think the second point is, if you've caught your interest and you're somehow convinced that you do want to kind of do a foray into investing in a Filipino startup, there are, a number of resources that are available to you to be able to do that, right? Working with local groups like James and myself, right? Like, or the main QBO, like maybe a couple of others, right? And, even the government, I think we're all very open and, friendly and nice also to kind of help you navigate that path. But also, maybe, and if it's to some extent easier, right? And James also touched on this, like there are definitely paths to do this also by investing through a Singapore entity, right? Which guys like RHT Law can help you with. And these are all kind of ways to be able to participate in the kind of Filipino startup ecosystem while maybe staying within, like, a regulatory regime that's more familiar. And then the third is like looking at sort of the prospects for growth, right? Like there are a lot of areas still, like, the government is very invested in kind of ensuring that, like, there are incentives and there are mechanisms through which companies that are operating with the Philippines, in particular tech companies, right, are able to succeed. And in general, it has been like a very kind of stable kind of environment politically, and also, again, like other factors like the English speaking, the demographic dividends, which we'll expect to continue to reap for at least another 5-10 years, right? So, and the very much improving kind of quality of founders and also quality of investors, mentors, and things like that are participating in the ecosystem. So looking forward, like, it's a good time to invest, just because, like, I'm quite bullish that there's only better things to come. So yeah, just do it. I think that's the short answer of my advice to people
Yes,
looking.
thanks. Yeah, thanks, Katrina, for putting forth the advice. And I guess this is also a response to what Johan Bell, who actually put in a question and answer. He put in a question on, he's a consultancy startup in Singapore supporting client going through innovation and working with tech and health techs. He was asking, how do we suggest that it could be connected with both Philippines and Singapore-based clients and partners? So Katrina just already highlighted in her response. You can outreach to, I guess, Enterprise Singapore, RHT, even DTI, BOI, and of course QBO is a bridge between Singapore and Philippines. So therefore, that definitely could also address what Johan is looking at. Now, Katrina, one last question where specifically, I think this is a session panel, that a forum that is put up by the Philippines Embassy based in Singapore. And I guess a startup ecosystem in Philippines. And as you led a delegation here with startups actually looking at being domiciled in Singapore, how is it helpful for capital raising, and how does it, and perhaps just for the audience, right, to understand how that would also help us in terms of collaboration with Philippines and Singapore?
It's always been a good thing that, like, Singapore and Philippines has been very closely connected, sort of economically, and like the relationship is I would say quite seamless, right? So it's the way I usually put it is sort of like if Delaware C is the popular kind of structure when you're looking at the US and Silicon Valley companies, like it's not uncommon, right, for Filipino companies that are looking to raise capital, especially from overseas, to set up and be based in Singapore. So again, if you're an investor and you're already used to the Singapore structure, right, and the incentives and all these things, like this is something that is not unusual for Filipino companies to do, and again allows investors from around the region to be able to participate in the Filipino startup ecosystem without maybe having to go through the hoops of like understanding the Filipino kind of system and regulatory environment, right? So I think it's always I definitely appreciate like the effort that our respective kind of embassies and foreign departments have put into making sure that this is sort of a seamless kind of working relationship. So I think you get all of the benefits of like having companies that are able to operate and kind of do their business right in the Philippine market and kind of take advantage of all the talent pool and all the things that James and I have been talking about, while at the same time like being able to invest in an entity perhaps that is like based in Singapore, right? And all of the benefits that brings. And I think it also works, for companies like on both ends, right? Whether it's Philippine startups looking to kind of go into the Singapore market and vice versa. So yeah, like and there are many again company like there are definitely organizations that are out there to help you do that. So and so yeah, like I mean there are definitely a lot of benefits. I would say yeah, it's in general almost best practice at this point or quite established that like regional fundraising happens in Singapore, and it's something that we I think brings a lot of advantages as well to prospective investors, right? Just to make your lives a bit easier. But yeah.
Yes, so thank you. And that's probably an opportune time to also conclude the entire panel. I think you heard from the panelists a highlight about why with the improved credit rating and also with the transformation of the regulation here for a better investment regime, and also in terms of the liberalization in terms of investment, allowing 100% foreign investment into the companies here. So that probably presents good opportunities. And as what Katrina highlighted, I think Singapore and Philippines, great partnership here. There are network effects when it comes to capital raising. And therefore, I think given the strong bridge and relationship here, for those who are interested to invest in Philippines, do feel free to talk to Enterprise Singapore, talk to RHT, QBO as well, if not DTI and BOI. With that, thank you everyone, and then do give our panelists a round of applause. And thank you.
Thank you, Victor and panelists.